Well, our next special guest speaker is at this point not a contributor to the online journal. Nevertheless, he has been profoundly influential and important in the development of our latest publication, a book that is on sale here. Many of you have picked up a copy. Victory in the No-Go Zone, Winning the Fight Against Two-Tiered Policing. And in many ways, this is sort of directly or indirectly related to the very issue that Professor Ricardo Duchesne has raised. It has a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do with our ethnicity and heritage, because in fact we have not only two-tiered policing in our country, but we have two different sets of laws. One for those of us that are in the majority, and those for who are in every other kind of class and distinction. But our special guest author and speaker, Gary McHale, will speak more directly to that. Nevertheless, our special guest speaker is Mark Vandermaas, a close friend of Gary's, and was intimately involved in this project and in fact in the life of the story, as he will relate to you. Mark Vandermaas is the founder of Israel Truth Week and the Caledonia Victims Project. He was the leader of the Ipperwash Paper Project, which exposes how the official inquiry suppressed evidence from non-Native victims before making its recommendations. I'm so thankful to have Mark come forward, and he's going to speak a little bit about the book, about his involvement with Israel Truth Week and the Ipperwash Papers. Mark?
And all in 20 minutes. Can you guys do me a favor, please? We've been sitting a while. Would you just take a quick stretch break and introduce yourself to the people around you? Just a minute. I'm willing to give up 1 minute, but you got to be back. Please stand up, get a stretch, introduce yourself, tell people who you are. Come on, do it.
You're not Steve Worth. My name's Stuart, but you are.
Okay, that's it.
Hey, Stuart.
You're cutting into my time, real big time now. All right.
Hi, Steve. You're at the Montgomery Tavern Society.
Okay, let's go down. You can talk later. No, seriously, this is what this is all about, is getting together, and it's hard to focus when your bum's a little sore. So, Tristan invited me here to talk about the Ipperwash Papers. It's a project that we conducted early on in the fight for justice in Caledonia. I've worked with Gary McHale. I like to say now that for the last 7 years, we've been in the counter-propaganda, rule of law, restoration business. And we've gone to jail together, and we've gone to jail with some of the people that are in this room, like Stuart Lawton and Jack here, and Christine. It's been a great struggle, and you can read about the book. You all have a copy of the book, so you can read about that in there. Today is a little surreal for me. I really have to tell you, because after we were arrested for trying to put a Canadian flag up the first time in 2006, we were planning the next protest, which was going to be January the 20th. And there's also, I also got Randy here, Randy Fleming from Caledonia. He's gone to jail, and Pat Kinraid, sitting right beside him there, her husband went to jail, and I'm sure Gary would have mentioned it, but the book is actually dedicated to her husband, Merlin Kinraid, who was a former peacekeeper, and he was a warrior for freedom. He was valuable. So that was great. So today's a little weird for me, because I said to Gary after we'd been arrested, and after it looked like we were probably going to jail again, we'd experienced death threats, especially Gary. They've had police in their home on a number of occasions. I said, you know, when this is over, nobody's pinning a medal on us, and if we're lucky, we'll still be alive and out of jail. And we were both prepared to accept that consequence moving forward. And I'm really pleased to say, wow, I was wrong. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation pinned the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal on him. Maybe one of the few in Canada that was actually deserved. That's up for discussion. That's not to denigrate other holders, but definitely Gary's was. And today, Tristan Emanuel and Freedom Press have, to see you holding our book, our story, the story of how a small group of Canadian patriots, woefully underqualified, with no money, no power, no connections, no nothing. When you understand what that book is about teaching that everyone, the power of one person taking a stand. And I'm going to ask you a quick question, 2 questions. What happened in Ipperwash? Who are the victims in Ipperwash? Quickly, if you Google Ipperwash right now, who's the victim?
The natives.
Natives. Who are the victims in Caledonia?
Natives.
Natives? Actually, Caledonia.
You want the truth?
Actually, if you actually go and if you actually Google it, you will find probably more references to non-natives being victims. That's why you have a book in front of you. That's why Christy Blatchford wrote a book about Caledonia, what happened in it. Now, if you Google left-wing media, granted, yeah, you'll find the natives. But there's a fundamental difference today. Is that today everybody forgets the victims of Ipperwash and the lessons that were there. Nobody knows about them. We only know that Dudley George was killed. We have no idea what happened to those residents. I'm going to tell you, those residents suffered every little bit, every bit as much as people in Caledonia, and maybe some more. But you never hear about it. Why? Because there was nobody named Gary McHale up there. There were activists, there were great activists, but there was nobody willing to risk everything he had, and including his safety, to go up there and protest in the footsteps of Martin Luther King Jr. So it's been a real privilege to work with him and go to jail with him and all the other people who have supported us. Gary was the difference in Caledonia. Now today's, as I said, is a little surreal, not only because of this book that tells our story, but Gary McHale and I, we gave birth today. Now, you might look at us and say, is that where you might look at us and say, oh, is that what you've been carrying? But, there were a couple of people who should have been here, who were planning to be here today, but they had to kind of back out. Why? Because right now, as we speak, there are Jews and non-Jews united in protesting in Dundas, Ontario, at a Canadian Tire store to show their support for the Canadian Tire store that's being picketed by radical anti-Israel leftist loons because they carry a product that's made in Judea, Samaria, and Israel. They are there now. These were a group of people that we were introduced by Mary Lou Ambrosio, the Never Again group, and the people associated with them. And right now, they organized a protest. They got in touch with the dealer. I corresponded with the dealer late last night. It kind of cut into my preparation time and a little bit, but it was exciting because while we're sitting here, there are people protesting who learned mainly from us, from Gary, from coming to Caledonia, from coming to London to stand with me during my Blue Beret protest at a mosque that was supporting that despicable vote to Gaza nonsense. Who stood with us at the last SodaStream protest in Stony Creek that was written up in three of the largest Jewish newspapers and the Hamilton Spectator. And because we went there that day to show our support against these people trying to intimidate the Canadian Tire there, we stole their media message. So basically what I'm telling you is that for the last 2 years, we've been applying, Gary's been helping me greatly, but we've been applying the counter-propaganda lessons that we learned, that I learned from him and with him over the 7 years in the defense of Israel. I'm really happy. I want to thank Rabbi Jonathan Hausman. He's sitting, wave, Rabbi. Wave, Rabbi. You're going to hear from him tonight. This man is a driving force. He's I don't know what maybe it's the soul, he's the American soul of Israel Truth Week concept. He flew all the way up here on his own dime just to hear Gary McHale and I speak today. And Tristan, when he heard that, he said, we got to get him to speak. So you're going to hear him later today. He's the warrior rabbi. And his friend Bjorn Larson divides his time between Europe, Tennessee, and Toronto. He's sitting there right here. He's the head of the International Free Press Society. We have many, and some of our other Jewish friends in here. We're building a coalition of unity because I think the one speaker said it correctly. Saya was it? She said, you know, this isn't a Jewish issue or an Iranian issue. This is a Canadian issue. This is in the defense of freedom. Now let's get to Ipperwash. We wanted to understand, everybody says that, you know, if you talk to them, they'll say, well, you know, the police policy in Caledonia is directly resulted to, you know, the killing of Ipperwash, and they developed these policies, and now the police are racist. They're right that Ipperwash had something to do with Caledonia, but for the wrong reasons. In actual fact, Dudley George died because the police did not enforce the law in the years prior to his death. And the escalating violence claimed his life. So in other words, these policies were already in place. And what I did, how we discovered this, is I went up to Ipperwash to meet one of the activists there, and she took me to her lawyer's office where there was a ton of documents. And what we did is we assembled 400 pages of documents that never made it into the inquiry, and it's absolutely nauseating when you realize how bad that inquiry was, and how racist it was, and how it excluded the non-native voices. So what I'm going to do is, you can read the book, and there's a whole chapter on Ipperwash and the importance, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from you my presentation from our Ipperwash Papers press conference at Queen's Park, in the Queen's Park Media Studio on March 14th, 2007, 2.5 months before the inquiry released its report. Okay? This is how strong the evidence is going to be. So here we go. And by the way, the lady who was asking why the police don't stand up for the peaceful side, I'm hoping your question will be answered by the time I'm done. Okay. The Ipperwash Papers consist of victim impact statements, government correspondence at all levels, documentation obtained under Access to Information Act, witness statements, news reports and editorials before and after the death of Dudley George, investigative reports from journalists, submissions to the Ipperwash Inquiry, documents from the Inquirer's website, and correspondence to and from On Fire, the Ontario Federation for Individual Rights and Equality, an organization created to give a voice to traumatized residents in the aftermath of the unfortunate events of September 1995. That was when Dudley George was shot. On Fire had 1,250 members at its peak, and by way of comparison, the Ontario government had meetings with the Caledonia Alliance, a group consisting of just 12 members. This shows the importance of both On Fire and Mary Lou LaPratte, who served on its executive for more than 10 years. And at that, and speaking beside me was Mary Lou LaPratte and Gary McHale. The three of us were at this. And you can watch this, watch our presentations and download the same documents at ipperwashpapers.ca. Now, unfortunately, On Fire's leaders were excluded from testifying at the inquiry, believe it or not. The public will not hear that during the 2 years preceding the unfortunate events of September 95, the town of Beausejour, now Lambton Shores, warned provincial and federal government cabinet ministers, politicians, and bureaucrats of the real potential for injury and death in the area. The public will not hear how the residents were traumatized by the violent takeover of Camp Ipperwash in July 1995 by native rebels, just 2 months prior to Mr. George's death. How the violence was so extensive that the base security officer for CFB Toronto requested commendations for the soldiers involved for their courage. The public will not hear how the town blamed the Department of National Defense for the death of Dudley George and the terrorization of their community due to the DND's failure to remove illegal occupiers, failure to permit the law to be upheld, failure to protect its boundaries, and due to the military's retreat and desertion in the middle of the night. The public will not hear how residents and tourists were victimized by native criminals in the years prior to the death of Mr. George and afterwards, how they were re-victimized by OPP two-tier justice since as early as 1990, and how in May 1993, the Sarnia Observer issued an editorial titled, "Police Must Enforce the Laws." Now, compare this ominous warning a full 2 years before Mr. George's death with the Toronto Star editorial quoted by John Tory in the Ontario Legislature on December 22nd, 2006, that called for a return to the rule of law in Caledonia. The circumstances are disturbingly similar, and we should all be gravely concerned. Let me just take a time out. This was December 2006, and it was just a few months later, in the summer of 2007, that Sam Galtieri was nearly beaten to death and left with permanent brain damage in the house he was building for his daughter. And Sam and his wife are sitting right there. Okay? Exactly the same as in Ipperwash. They were warned that something was going to go wrong. Continue. This means the public will not hear from a witness who says he saw Dudley George holding a rifle with a scope on it just weeks before his death. Why? The inquiry didn't call him to testify. The public will not hear from a witness who says he saw natives at the unsecured crime scene raking the sand in the exact area where Dudley George fell and removing objects out of the sand, trees, fence posts, and shacks behind where the OPP were situated. Why? He was never called to testify. The public will not hear from residents who were told by their insurance companies that there would be no coverage for any damage or mass evacuation because the Ipperwash situation was considered to be a rebellion and an insurrection. The public will not hear how Ipperwash residents felt when the OPP fled the area for their own safety, as per the instructions of native militants, sound familiar to the people from Caledonia, and didn't return for almost a month. How residents calling for OPP assistance were told that the police would not come because they were targets for native criminals. The public will not hear how sick and elderly residents were abandoned in their homes by the OPP, who promised to come for them and never did. The public will not hear how the CSIS was so worried that the undefended residents would take the law into their own hands that they met regularly with on-fire members. The public will not hear how 8 natives beat a resident into unconsciousness with such viciousness that he suffered permanent damage to his hand, or how a witness to the event had to call 911 7 times before the OPP responded. So the question that you have to be asking now is how? How can we be so sure that the people of Ontario will not hear any of this from the Ipperwash inquiry? Because the residents were not allowed to speak at the inquiry. Out of 139 witnesses who testified during the inquiry, not one was a full-time resident. Not one resident was permitted to testify to the native violence that occurred for 4 years prior to Dudley George's death, and not one resident has been allowed to testify to the violence since 1995. In short, the people of Ipperwash have been silenced. In July 2004, the inquiry received a chronological account of the Ipperwash tragedy, which is in your press kit. The Ipperwash inquiry has never published this chronology of events at Ipperwash. The only project submitted to the inquiry that directly addressed the suffering of residents and the possible relationship between the OPP DND refusal to enforce the law against native criminals and the death of Dudley George is nowhere to be found on the inquiry's website. The inquiry gave standing to the occupiers who had violently overthrown the former army camp, but denied it to the residents who suffered through more than a decade of violence, intimidation, and crime by native operating from the base. An area known to local residents as the home-free zone because the OPP do not police it, even to this day. An area where the remains of 2 dismembered bodies have been found. You never heard about those, did you? The Ipperwash inquiry cannot and will not reveal any of the residents' suffering because during the past 3 years, the inquiry allotted a grand total of just 90 minutes for community consultation that took place during a single meeting on June 21st, 2006, at the height of tensions in Caledonia. And what's disturbing about this so-called community consultation is that the inquiry's minutes and the characterization of this meeting were sanitized. Even more troubling, however, the inquiry's summary suggests that the inquiry's conclusions may well have been decided in advance. And they basically, I have to move on time, so I'm going to have to skip a few pieces. But basically, the inquiry's community consultation report says basically there was no really serious problems between natives and residents, and if there were, it was because the residents were racist or ignorant of native culture. And even worse, the inquiry will never be able to answer the question of how to prevent violence against innocent residents in Caledonia or any other town facing land claims. Why? Because they never asked the question. The Ipperwash inquiry never addressed the issue of preserving the rule of law during land claims. Not a single symposium, not a single project prepared by the inquiry or any other third party focused on that issue. And the frightening reality is this: if the Ipperwash inquiry released its report today and the government could implement its findings tomorrow, the next town to face a land claim would have no guidelines for preventing land claim terror against innocent residents. The Ipperwash inquiry deprived Ontario and all of Canada of the opportunity to explore what role two-tier justice policies played in the death of Mr. George. What was interesting is we were absolutely right. Out of 100 recommendations that the inquiry made, there's not a single one specifically directed at preventing violence against innocent people. It's sickening. What was really interesting is out of those recommendations, the inquiry made 4 specifically about so-called peacekeeping policies. The idea that police should be peacekeepers rather than law enforcement agencies. And it was, as a former peacekeeper, I find that quite telling, because peacekeeping is not about investigating crimes. It's not about protecting victims. It's not about protecting charter rights. All it is getting in the way of two groups trying to kill each other. And it should be very scary that when the word peacekeeping was being floated by the Premier of Ontario and the OPP Commissioner, it should have been a red flag to journalists and politicians everywhere. And yet, not one member of the Ontario Legislature has stood in the Legislature and denounced this inquiry or these so-called peacekeeping recommendations. These peacekeeping recommendations don't just apply to native land disputes. They apply to all situations. So when I was doing a protest, a simple vigil for 1 hour a day with my blue beret on at a mosque to protest that boat to Gaza, first question I asked them, are you familiar with the Ipperwash inquiry? It means we don't make arrests. And what they do is they target the people who they deem to be violating the peace. So it doesn't matter. And that should be a great danger. This should be really careful. This should be a great concern to you. Because of what happened in Caledonia, there are $4.1 billion in economic losses, hundreds of millions in policing, and this is the key, when the Islamic no-go zones come to Canada, our police are already pre-wired for this. And you can expect that they will arrest those who are protesting, because I promise you, Gary McHale and I will be walking into the no-go zones, and we will be arrested, and that. So we have to discredit the inquiry completely. You can do that by reading the Ipperwash chapter and quoting it in any letters that you have. And the other thing I would do is get a business card from me. Next year we're launching the Summer of Truth, and it's we're going to get we're going to start launching rallies, a series of rallies as part of Israel Truth Week. And our goal is to unite Jews and non-Jews together in defense of freedom. So please come and see me. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your indulgence.